My name is Lucy Cole, and I have been told more than once that the woman who came back from the line is not the woman who left it. I have stopped arguing the point. They are right, and they are wrong, and the only person who could ever explain the difference would have to have been out there with me, past the picket, past the last of our drones, in the dark where the sun was a pinhole and the cold did not have a name yet. I was out there for 114 days. I came back the way they all do, in a recovery capsule with a saline drip in my arm and a counselor reading from a script, and for the first 3 weeks they told me everything I was feeling was normal. After the 3rd week they stopped saying that. They stopped using the word normal at all. I should start before that. I should start the way a soldier starts, with the where and the when, because the rest of it only makes sense if you understand the geometry of the thing. We were at war. We had been at war, in the slow grinding way that distance allows, for 9 years by then. The enemy was the Vaeli. We did not call them that at first. We called them the swarm, or the bloom, or the thing the picket boats kept losing sight of out past the Kuiper line. The name Vaeli came from one of their own broadcasts, decoded in the 3rd year, and it was less a name than a sound, a wet click followed by a held tone, and the linguists picked it because it was the closest noise a human throat could reproduce without bleeding. They were not like us. Understand that first, because if you do not understand it, you will not understand anything else. The Vaeli did not have selves. They had a hive, a colonial mind spread across millions of bodies, and the bodies were not soldiers in the way our boys were soldiers. They were limbs. They were fingers of a single intention, and the intention did not love them, and it did not mourn them, and when one of them died, the rest did not notice any more than you would notice a fingernail clipping. We figured this out the hard way. We figured most things out the hard way. The first time a Vaeli scout form let us capture it alive, we sat it in an interrogation room with a translator and a doctor and asked it what it wanted, and it told us, through a clicking apparatus strapped to its mouth parts, that it wanted nothing because it was nothing, and then it stopped breathing on purpose and would not start again. The Hive had decided it was compromised. The Hive cut the finger off. I flew strike fighters in the 3rd Squadron out of Houston Orbital, back when Houston Orbital was still a working command and not the half-melted bulb of slag it became after the 2nd Bloomfall. My husband Drew worked groundside. He was a sensor engineer. He calibrated the long arrays that listened for Vaeli movement in the outer dark, and he was, in every way that the word can be meant kindly, a gentle man. Drew did not curse. Drew did not raise his voice. Drew brought me coffee in the morning and put a hand on the small of my back when I was reading and asked nothing of me except that I come home. We had no children of our own. We had Iris. Iris was Drew's niece on his sister's side, and his sister had not survived the Houston Dome strike in the 7th year. Iris was 16 by the time I tell you about, a quiet, long-limbed girl with her mother's mouth and a way of looking at adults like she was checking their work. She lived with us. She called Drew uncle and she called me Lucy, never Aunt Lucy, and I did not correct her because I think we both understood that I was not built for that word. I was fond of her. I want to make that clear. Whatever happened later, whatever I dragged her into, I was fond of her, and what I did with her in the car next to me on purpose, and I will not pretend otherwise to make it easier on myself. My grandmother lived in a clapboard house on the dry side of the Houston reclamation zone, and she had been told to evacuate 4 separate times, and she had told 4 separate evacuation officers to go to hell, and they had stopped sending them. Her name was Holbrook. Everyone called her Nana. She smoked thin brown cigarettes that she rolled herself, and she drank bourbon out of a jelly jar, and she had outlived 2 husbands and 1 war already, and she did not consider the Vaeli a serious problem because, in her words, anything that did not bleed could not really be killed, and anything that could not really be killed was just weather. She was the only person I knew who could make me laugh after I came back. I want to tell you about the mission, the one that did it. I will try to tell it the way it happened and not the way I remember it, because those are 2 different stories now, and the way I remember it has a color in it that should not exist. We were running a deep picket sweep, 3 boats, mine and 2 others, out past the orbit of what used to be called Sedna before Sedna stopped being a useful word. The Vaeli had been seeding something out there. We did not know what. The arrays Drew tuned could hear the seeding but could not see it, and what Command wanted was eyes. So they sent 3 pilots and 3 boats, and one of those pilots was a man named Carver, and one of them was a woman named Petty, and one of them was me. We flew in a loose triangle. We were 11 days out from the last refueling drone. We were past the point where any rescue was a serious word, and we all knew it, and none of us said it, because saying it is bad manners in the service. On the 89th day out, Carver's boat went dark. No mayday, no telemetry spike. One moment his transponder was a steady green dot on my console, and the next moment it was gone, and the gap between those 2 moments was less than a second. Petty and I held formation for 6 hours, the way we were trained, and then we went looking. We found his boat, most of it. The hull had been opened the way a child opens a piece of fruit, peeled back in 3 even sections, and what was inside the hull was not Carver and not anything that had ever been Carver. The Vaeli had taken him apart to see how he worked. They had laid the pieces out on the inside of the cockpit in what the analysts later called an arrangement, and the arrangement was not random. It was, they told me, a kind of writing. They told me what they thought it said, but they would not put it in the official report. I will not put it here either. I will say this. I will say that whatever they had done to Carver had been done quickly, and with no malice, and with a kind of clinical interest that was harder to bear than malice would have been. Malice is a thing one human pays another. Malice is, in its own way, a recognition. What had been done to Carver was the work of a thing that had not recognized him at all. The arrangement on the inside of the cockpit was the work of a child sorting beach pebbles by color. Carver had been beach pebbles. Carver had been a man with a wife and 2 boys outside El Paso, and a habit of humming under his breath when he was concentrating, and the Vaeli had not noticed any of it. They had noticed only that he was made of parts, and that the parts came apart in regular ways, and that the regularity could be made into a pattern, and the pattern, the analysts told me later, was a kind of question. The Vaeli had been asking us a question with Carver's body. I do not know if we have answered it yet. Petty cried over the comm for 19 minutes. I let her. I did not cry. I was looking out the canopy of my boat, and there was a flicker out past Carver's wreck, a single sharp point of light that should not have been there, and I turned my boat toward it without telling Petty, and I burned hard, and I crossed 8,000 kilometers in the time it took her to stop crying, and when I got there I saw the thing they had been seeding. It was a structure. I will call it a structure because there is no honest word for it. It was the size of a small moon, and it was not solid. It was a kind of woven dark, and it was breathing. I do not mean that figuratively. The whole of it was expanding and contracting on a slow rhythm, a count of about 40 seconds in and 40 seconds out, and inside the dark of it there were lights, thousands of lights, each one a Vaeli body in a kind of stasis, and they were waiting. They were waiting for something. I sat my boat off its perimeter, and I looked at it, and I felt the bottom of my mind open. I will try to describe this, and I will fail. The Vaeli, all of them, were one mind, and the structure was where that mind kept itself. Not all of it, a node of it, a ganglion. And because the mind was a single mind, and because I was close enough to be inside the field of its thinking, for a count of perhaps 30 seconds I was inside it, not as a guest, as a leak. I felt what it felt. I felt the scale of it. I felt the count of its years, which was not a number a person could hold, and I felt the count of its bodies, which was likewise not a number, and I felt, underneath all of that, the simple flat fact that to the thing I was looking at I was less than a mosquito to a man. I was less than a mosquito to a man asleep. I was nothing, and Drew was nothing, and Nana was nothing, and Iris was nothing, and the war we had been losing for 9 years was nothing. And at the bottom of that nothing there was something else, a color, the one I told you about, a color that does not exist on Earth but that I have looked for in every sunset since, and it was the color of the thing's patience. Then the field broke and I was a woman in a boat again and my hands were shaking, and Petty was screaming over the comm asking where I was, and I burned back to her without answering and I did not tell anyone what I had seen. Not Petty. Not the debrief. Not Drew. I told them I had gone to investigate a sensor ghost and found nothing. I lied in the official record. I have never lied in an official record before or since. I lied because I understood, in the moment of looking at the structure, that if I told command what was in the dark out there, they would send more boats, and the boats would die, and the dying would not matter to the thing I had seen, and the only thing that would matter, the only thing, was finding a way to make it matter. To make a thing that did not have a self feel the loss of a finger. To make weather bleed. I came home. I sat in the recovery ward and I let the doctors talk. I let the counselor read her script. When Drew came to get me, he had brought a small bouquet of yellow flowers and he had cut his hair, and he stood in the doorway of the ward and looked at me with such relief and such love that I thought, for 1 second, that the color would go away. Then I looked at his hands and I looked past his hands at the wall, and the wall was not real to me. The wall was a paper screen with the real thing behind it, and the real thing was the dark with the lights in it, and Drew was a man standing in front of a paper screen, pretending the screen was the world. I went home with him. I ate the dinner he cooked. I held Iris when she came in from school and I let her tell me about her week and I nodded in the right places. I lay next to Drew in our bed and I let him put his arm around me and I waited for him to fall asleep. And then I got up and I sat in the kitchen in the dark with a glass of water and I looked at the window and I thought about how small the kitchen was. How small the house. How small the city. I thought about the dome over the city and I thought about the air being pumped through it and I thought how thin the dome was, how thin the air, how thin all of it. And I felt the color again and I drank the water and I went back to bed. That was the first night. They were all that night after. I went back to duty. They put me through 6 weeks of evaluation, and they cleared me with a flag in the file that meant nothing to anyone who didn't read flags. I asked to be put on the rotation for the next deep picket. They told me I had to wait. They told me the next picket was 11 months out, and that in the meantime I would train, and that the training would include simulator hours and underwater drills and what they called integration sessions, which was their word for therapy. I went to the therapy. I did not say what I had seen. I said what I was supposed to say. I learned to perform the recovery the way you learn to perform a cover identity, and the therapist was pleased with me, and I was promoted to the short list for the next mission, and that was when I met Mark Goodwin. The therapist's name was Dr. Haverson. She was 40-something, and she wore a navy cardigan in every season, and she had been doing reintegration work for 14 years. She was good at her job. I want that in the record. She was good at her job, and I lied to her every Tuesday at 10 in the morning for 9 months, and I lied so well that she signed off on me, and the signing off was not her failure. It was mine. She would ask me in her careful way whether I had experienced any sense of disconnection from familiar surroundings. I would say sometimes, but it is improving. She would ask whether I had experienced any unusual sensory phenomena. I would say no. She would ask whether I felt I could resume normal duties. I would say, yes, ma'am. I would say it with the particular flat affect of a soldier who has been asked too many questions, and she would mark a box on her form, and I would walk out of her office and stand in the corridor for a minute with my hand against the wall, because the wall was paper, and the corridor was paper, and the only real thing in the building was the color I was keeping behind my teeth. Mark was a major. He had flown 3 deep pickets, more than anyone else still on active duty, and he had the air of a man who had decided some time ago that the rules did not apply to him because the rules had been written by people who had never been past the line. He was tall. He had gray at the temples. He drank. The first time I met him was in the officers' lounge at Houston Orbital, and he looked at me across the bar and he said, without preamble, "You saw something out there." I said I did not know what he meant. He said, "You saw something out there and you didn't put it in the report." I said nothing. He said, "Welcome to the club." I am not going to tell this part the way it deserves. I am not going to dress it up. I went to bed with Mark Goodwin, and I knew while I was doing it that I was doing it because he was the only person I had met who had also looked at the structure, or one like it, and had also lied about it, and the thing in him recognized the thing in me. It was not love. I do not want to use that word for it. Drew is the man I loved. Drew was the man I was failing to love because the color had gotten in the way. Mark was something else. Mark was a mirror. He had a wife once. He did not anymore. He lived in officers' housing on the Houston pad, and he drank a particular kind of bourbon that Nana also drank, which I noticed and did not say, and he had a way of laughing that was not really laughing. It was the noise a man makes when he has decided that the alternative is worse. We met 3 or 4 nights a week. I told Drew I was on extended sim rotation. Drew believed me, because Drew believed me about everything, and I think about that now more than I think about anything else. There was a younger officer named Erin Eccles, captain then on the same short list as me. She had not been past the line. She was being groomed for it. She was smart and she was hungry and she was 28 years old and she had not yet learned to lie in an official report, which made her, from where I was standing, dangerous. Mark started sleeping with her too. He did not tell me. I found out the way you find out these things, which is by paying attention. I want to skip ahead. I want to tell you about the water tank. We trained for vacuum egress in a deep pool, 120 feet, full pressure suits, weighted boots, a mock-up of a Vaeli hull section at the bottom. The drill was to breach the section, place a charge, and egress before the simulated pressure shift killed you. The standing record was held by Erin Eccles, 22 minutes and 7 seconds. I went down on a Tuesday in the 8th month of my training, and I beat her record by 4 minutes. I did it by turning off my regulator at the 90-foot mark and breathing the residual mix in my suit, which is not within procedure, and is, in fact, against 3 separate safety regulations. My heart rate at the bottom of the tank was 41 beats per minute. The dive supervisor told me later that he had been watching the telemetry, and he had thought for almost a full minute that I had died down there and was simply continuing the drill out of inertia. He said it like a joke. I did not laugh. I did not laugh because 41 beats per minute was the slowest my heart had been since I came back from the line, and being at the bottom of that pool with the regulator off was the closest I had felt to the dark with the lights in it. And I understood, climbing out, that I had been chasing that feeling for 8 months without numbing it. The water at 120 feet has a particular quality. It is colder than it has any right to be, because the heaters do not reach the bottom, and the light coming down from the surface lamps has been bent and softened by the column of it above you, and the result is a kind of twilight that does not exist anywhere else on the planet. I had spent more hours in that twilight than any pilot in my class. I knew the exact spot on the bottom where the mock-up was bolted to the floor. I knew the shadow it threw at 900 and the different shadow it threw at 1400. The pool, by the 8th month, was the only place at Houston Orbital where I felt I could draw a full breath, which is a sentence that should have been a warning to me and to the medical officers who signed off on my training hours, and which was, instead, a sentence I kept to myself, the way I kept everything to myself in those months. That night I went to Mark's quarters and he wasn't there. The lights were off. I waited in the corridor for 40 minutes and then I went back to Drew and I sat on the edge of the bed and Drew said, "You're shivering." And I said, "I'm fine." And Drew put his arms around me and held me and I let him because I could not think of what else to do. The next morning I learned that Mark had been with Erin. I learned this because Erin told me herself, with the particular awkward kindness of a younger woman who thinks she is being adult, in a hallway outside the briefing room, and she put her hand on my arm when she said it. I did not hit her. I have been congratulated for that by several people who did not see my face in the moment, but I want the record to show that I considered it, and the only reason I did not is that I had already begun, by then, to think of Erin as a smaller problem than the one I was actually trying to solve. The mission slot came up 2 weeks later. There were 3 names in the running. Mine, Erin's, and a man named Hutchins who had a bad back and was a courtesy name. The selection went to Aaron. I was told by my a colonel named Frank Paxton, in his office on a Thursday, that the selection had been Mark's recommendation, and that Mark had cited my underwater incident as evidence of recklessness, and that the matter was not open to appeal. Frank Paxton was a good man. He told me this the way a good man tells a bad thing. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Cole, you're grounded for the next cycle. I'm sorry. The next cycle would be 22 months out. 22 months. I did the math in my head while he was still talking. I did the math and I understood that Mark had not benched me because of the pool. Mark had benched me because he had seen, the same way I had seen in him, the thing in me that recognized the structure in the dark, and he had decided that he did not want a second person in the cockpit who knew what he knew. He had decided to ground me to protect himself. This is the part where the story turns, and I want to be careful with it, because what I did next is the thing they put me away for, and I do not want anyone reading this to think I did it in a fog. I was not in a fog. I have never been clearer in my life than I was on the morning I made the decision. The color was steady. The color was the floor I was standing on. I knew exactly what I was doing. Nana died on a Wednesday. I was at Mark's place when she died. I was not in the room with her, which is a fact I will carry for the rest of whatever time I have, and Drew was the one who held her hand at the end, and Drew was the one who called me, and I let the call go to voicemail, because Mark was pouring me a bourbon and I did not want to disrupt the pouring. By the time I called back, she was 3 hours dead. Drew did not cry on the phone. Drew said, "She went easy, Lucy. She went easy, and I should have wept. I should have torn my hair. I sat on the edge of Mark's bed and I looked at the wall, and the wall was paper. We buried her on Friday. I wore black. Ira stood next to me and held my hand the whole service, and I felt her hand in mine the way you feel a small bird, and I knew that the bird was real and the rest of the room was paper, and that the only way to make any of it real again was to do the thing I had decided to do. Drew watched me across the grave. Drew did not speak to me. Drew, I think, had begun to understand by then. Not what, but that. After the service, I went to Nana's house and I packed a bag. I left Drew a note. The note said, "I am sorry. I love you. Take care of Iris." The note was a lie in its last line, because I went into Iris's room and I told her to pack a bag too, and she did, without asking why, which is something I think about. She must have known. She must have known something. She was 16 and she packed a bag and she got in the car with me. And she sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, and she said, "Where are we going, Lucy?" And I said, "We are going to fix something," and she nodded, and she did not ask me to take her home. I want to say here, because it matters, that I did not intend to hurt Iris. I did not intend her to be in any danger. I brought her with me for 2 reasons, and I will tell you both. The first reason is that Iris was the last living thing in my life that I could still feel without the paper between us. When Iris held my hand at the grave, the bird in my palm was real. I needed to keep the bird in my palm a little longer. The second reason is harder to say. I brought Iris with me because I knew, somewhere underneath the color, that what I was about to do was wrong, and I thought that if Iris was in the car I would not be able to do all of it. I thought she would be a brake. I was using a child as a brake on myself. That is what I am admitting to. I want it in the record. Mark's launch was scheduled for Sunday morning out of the Cape facility. He was in quarantine until then on a sealed level, unreachable. But the launch crew rotated through a transit hub 1,000 miles from Houston, and the rotation was, by long-standing tradition, the last chance any astronaut had to see family or settle accounts before going up. I knew the schedule. Every astronaut knew the schedule. I knew which terminal, which gate, which hour. I drove. I drove for 14 hours straight, Iris dozing in the seat next to me, the road dark and then light and then dark again, and I did not stop except for fuel. I had brought, in a bag in the back seat, a service-issue sidearm, a length of insulated cable, a roll of medical tape, and a small canister of a sedative gas that I had taken from the training annex 2 weeks earlier, which is a theft I had committed in advance, which tells you what you need to know about the fog I was not in. I was going to take Aaron Eccles. I want to say this plainly. I was going to take her in the transit hub when she came through with Mark on the launch shuttle. I was going to put her in the trunk of the car, and I was going to drive her somewhere quiet, and I was going to ask her some questions, and then I do not know what I was going to do, and that uncertainty is mine to carry. I had a plan up to the trunk, and then the plan went dark. The color filled it. We got to the hub at 4 in the morning. I parked in the long-term lot. I told Iris to stay in the car. Iris said, "Lucy, what are you doing?" And I said, "I am going to go talk to someone." And Iris looked at me, and I will tell you what she said, because what she said is the thing that saved me, although I did not understand it that way at the time. Iris said, "Lucy, you smell like Nana's bourbon and you haven't slept in 2 days. Please don't go." I went anyway. I went into the terminal and I sat in a coffee shop with a sight line to the gate and I waited. The launch team came through at 5:15 in their blue jumpsuits, a small loose group, and Mark was at the back of it laughing at something one of the techs had said, and Erin was at the front of it and she saw me before I saw her. She saw me through the glass of the coffee shop. I had not changed my face. I had not put on a wig or a hat. I had not even taken off my service jacket. I had driven 1,000 miles to do this, and I had not bothered to disguise myself, because somewhere in my head I had wanted to be seen. I had wanted Mark to see me. I had wanted him to know that I had come. Erin's face did not change. She did not cry out. She did not point. She stopped walking and she looked at me through the glass, and then she looked at Mark, and then she looked back at me. And in that look, in the look from a young woman who had not been past the line, was a kind of clarity I had not felt in 9 months. Erin was not paper. Erin was real. Erin was a young officer on her way to do a hard thing, and she was looking at me and she was deciding, in real time, what kind of woman I was going to be remembered as. And I understood, sitting there with my hand on the strap of the bag with the sedative in it, that I had the answer to my own question. I had been asking, all the way out past Sedna, all the way down to the bottom of the pool, all the way through the bourbon and the bed and the grave, what could possibly matter inside the geometry of a thing as large as the Vaeli? I had been looking for a thing that would matter, and the answer was sitting outside a coffee shop in a transit hub at 5 in the morning in a blue jumpsuit, looking back at me, deciding whether to ruin my life. She decided not to. She looked at me for a long count, and then she looked away, and she said something to Mark that I could not hear, and she walked on, and Mark turned and saw me, and Mark's face went the color of cement, and Mark also said nothing, and the launch team passed through the gate and out toward the shuttle, and I sat in the coffee shop with my hand on the bag, and I did not move for a long time. I went back to the car. Iris was asleep against the window. I started the engine. I drove us back toward Houston. The sun came up somewhere east of the second fuel stop, and Iris woke and rubbed her eyes and looked at the road and said, "Did you do what you were going to do?" And I said no, and she said okay, and she went back to sleep. I drove with my hands at 10 and 2. I drove the whole way back not crying, because crying would have been a small thing, and I was past small things. Drew was waiting on the porch when we pulled up. Drew had not slept. Drew did not ask me where I had been. Drew helped Iris out of the car, and he walked her into the house, and he put her to bed, and he came back out onto the porch, and he sat down next to me on the step, and he said, "The MPS are coming, Lucy. They'll be here in an hour." I said, "I know." He said, "What did you do?" I said, "Nothing." I said, "I almost did something, and I didn't." He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "I want you to tell me one thing." He said, "When you were up there, did you see something?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because if I told you, you wouldn't have stayed." He cried then. Drew cried in the way that gentle men cry, which is silently and without putting his face in his hands. And I watched the sun come up over the fence, and I waited for the MPS, and we did not speak again before they came. They took me in. They charged me with theft of service materials, with unauthorized travel, with conduct unbecoming, with 3 other things I have forgotten. They did not charge me with what I had been planning, because I had not done it, and the bag in the car was deemed circumstantial. I was held in administrative confinement for 11 weeks. I was visited twice by a psychologist and once by Frank Paxton, who sat across from me and said nothing for 10 minutes and then stood up and left, which I considered a kindness. I was discharged, not court-martialed, discharged. The flag in my file became a different flag. I was, the document said, medically unfit for duty. Now I want to tell you the rest. I want to tell you what happened to Mark because it matters, and I want to tell you what I did about it, because that is the part that the discharge papers do not have. Mark went up. He launched on Sunday morning on schedule with Aaron on the crew. They went out past the picket line, on a deep insertion mission whose objective was classified above my pay grade then and above my clearance now. What I know is what was made public 8 months later, which was that the mission encountered a Vaeli structure, much like the one I had seen, and that the encounter went poorly and that the crew was lost. All 4 of them, Mark and Aaron and 2 others. The Vaeli took the boat apart the way they had taken Carver's apart, and they left an arrangement, and the arrangement was photographed by a follow-up drone, and the photograph is, I am told, locked in a vault under a mountain in Colorado, and no one who has seen it will speak of it. I read the casualty notice in my kitchen. I had a glass of water in my hand. Drew was in the next room. I put the glass down carefully because my hand was shaking and I did not want to break it. I did not cry for Mark. I cried for Aaron. I cried for the young woman who had decided not to ruin my life and had then gone up into the dark and been written into a sentence I would never be allowed to read. 3 weeks after the casualty notice, I drove out to the reclamation zone, to Nana's house, which was now mine. I sat in her front room. I drank her bourbon. I thought about the structure. I thought about the color. And I thought about what I had not told anyone, including the debrief officers who had asked me, in the 11 weeks of confinement, whether I had any information regarding Vaeli installations beyond the line that I had failed to report. I had not told them about the leak. I had not told them that for 30 seconds I had been inside the mind of the thing. I had not told them, because telling them would have meant admitting that I had lied in an official report 9 months earlier, and admitting that would have been the end of any chance I had of ever flying again. By the time I was in confinement, that was a moot point, because I was never going to fly again anyway. But by then I had also realized something else. I had realized that the leak had not been one way. The Vaeli had felt me too. I do not have proof of this. I have a feeling, which is the worst kind of evidence, but I have lived with the feeling long enough to know it is not nothing. When the mind brushed against mine in the dark for those 30 seconds, it had taken a measurement. It had filed me. It had me in it, somewhere, the way a hive remembers the shape of a sting. And when the structure judged who to send a follow-up team toward, when it decided which boat to take apart and which to ignore, I think, and I cannot prove, that it had remembered me. I think Mark died because he was on a boat that the Vaeli were waiting for, and the Vaeli were waiting because they thought the boat might be mine. I sat in Nana's front room with this thought, and I drank her bourbon, and I waited for the color to come, and the color came, and for the first time since the line I welcomed it. Because the color, I understood, was not damage. The color was a connection. The leak had not closed. The structure had touched me, and the touch had left a wire, and the wire ran both ways, and if I was careful, and if I was patient, and if I was willing to be the kind of woman the discharge papers said I was, I could send something back down that wire. I went to Frank Paxton. I went to him at his house on a Saturday in civilian clothes, and I sat in his kitchen and I told him everything. I told him about the structure. I told him about the 30 seconds. I told him about the lie in the report. I told him about Mark. I told him about the wire. Frank Paxton listened to me for 2 hours without interrupting once. When I was done, he poured me a glass of water and he sat down across from me and he said, "Cole, you understand that what you're describing, if it's real, is the biggest piece of intelligence this war has ever produced?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You understand that if I take it upstairs, the first thing they will do is doubt you, and the second thing they will do is doubt me for listening to you." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, you understand that if it is real, what you are offering is yourself. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, that is not nothing to offer. And I said, I know what it is to offer, sir. I have done the arithmetic. He took it upstairs. They doubted me. They doubted him. They put me through 3 weeks of evaluation by people I had never seen before in a facility I cannot name, and at the end of the 3 weeks they decided, against the unanimous recommendation of their own psychiatrists, that the operation was worth attempting. The operation had a code name I will not write here. The operation involved putting me back in a boat, a small boat, a one-way boat, with a payload in the cargo bay of a kind that I am also not going to describe, except to say that it had been waiting in a hangar in Colorado for 6 years for the right delivery system. And the right delivery system, it turned out, was a woman the Vaeli already knew. The plan was simple in the way that suicide is simple. I would take the boat out to the coordinates of the structure I had found, which the arrays had since confirmed and triangulated. I would not approach silently. I would broadcast. I would make sure the structure knew I was coming. I would let the leak open. I would let the wire light up. I would think as loudly as I could about being a finger of the hive. I would invite them in. And when they came, when the mind reached out to take its measurement again, I would be close enough to deliver the payload to the ganglion at the heart of the structure, and I would detonate, and the leak would carry the detonation inward, the way a shock travels up a nerve, and the hive, or at least this node of it, or at least some part of some node, would feel a thing that hives are not designed to feel. It would feel a finger that did not just stop working. It would feel a finger that hated it. I want you to understand what the planners told me before we go any further. They told me they did not know if it would work. They told me they thought there was perhaps a 1 in 4 chance that the payload, delivered the way we proposed to deliver it, would actually cause damage to the structure rather than just to my boat. They told me there was perhaps a 1 in 20 chance that the damage, if any, would propagate along the hive network the way I was theorizing. And they told me there was effectively no chance that I would survive the delivery. That was not in the percentages. That was the floor of the building. I asked them how long I had to decide. They said 24 hours. I went home. I did not tell Drew where I had been. I made dinner. I burned the rice. Drew ate it without complaining. After dinner, Iris came down and sat at the table, and the 3 of us played cards for 2 hours, and Iris won, and she gloated about it, and Drew laughed in the gentle way Drew laughed, and I watched them across the table, and I thought about the paper screen, and I thought about the bird in my palm, and I realized that the screen was gone. I had not noticed when it went. Sometime between Aaron's look through the coffee shop glass and Frank Paxton's kitchen, the paper had come down, and the people at the table were real to me, and the kitchen was real to me, and Drew was real to me, and the color was still there, but the color was no longer the floor. The color was a tool. The color was something I had and could use instead of something that had me. I went to bed with Drew that night. I did not tell him. I held him. I held him for a long time. I think he knew. I think Drew, somewhere in his sensor engineer mind, had been able to hear the shape of what was coming from the way I held him. He did not ask. He let me hold him. In the morning, I made him coffee the way he liked it, and I kissed Iris on the forehead, and I drove to the base, and I signed the papers. The boat was waiting. It was a stripped-down picket sled, no armor, no comms past the immediate window, no return fuel. The payload was in a sealed bay aft of the cockpit. The launch was quiet. There was no ceremony. Frank Paxton was on the gantry. He saluted me. I returned the salute. He said, "Cole," and then he didn't say anything else, and I understood, and I went up the ladder. I will not bore you with the transit. 81 days. I read books. I slept badly. I thought about Nana, and I thought about Iris, and I thought, more than I expected to, about Aaron, about her face through the glass. The Aaron in my head was not the Aaron who had slept with Mark. The Aaron in my head was a young officer who had been kind to me at a moment when kindness was the most expensive thing in the room, and she had paid for it later in the dark, and I owed her. There is a thing they do not tell you about long transit, even after you have done it once. They do not tell you that the boat becomes, after about the 3rd week, a kind of confessional. The walls close in not on your body but on the inside of your head, and the silence of deep space, which is not really silence but the low whisper of the heaters and the air recycler and your own pulse, becomes a thing you can speak into. I spoke into it. I spoke to Carver, who had not deserved what was done to him, and I told him I was sorry I had not been faster on the comms. I spoke to Nana, who would have understood every part of what I was doing, and who would have poured me a bourbon while I did it. I spoke to Mark, which surprised me because I had not thought I had anything left to say to him, and what I said to him in the dark of the boat I will not repeat here, but the saying of it took most of one watch cycle, and at the end of it I felt the small, clean relief of a debt closed. I spoke to Drew last and longest. I spoke to Drew almost every day. I told him about the boat. I told him about the payload. I told him what I was going to try to do and why I was going to try to do it, and I told him that I knew now what I had not been able to say to him in the kitchen on the night Frank Paxton's MPS were coming. I told him that I had not lied in the report to protect myself. I had lied in the report because I had been afraid that if I told the truth, Command would send someone else, someone like Carver, and Carver would die for what I had seen. I told Drew that I had been carrying that lie for 2.5 years, and that the only way to put the lie down was to be the one who answered for it, and that this boat, this transit, this payload, was me answering for it. I do not know if Drew heard any of it. I do not know if the dead hear. I think they might. I think the dead might be the only audience honest enough to listen to a confession all the way through without interrupting. On the 70th day I saw, on the long-range optical, the first faint shape of the structure against the star field. It had grown. Either it had grown or it had been larger than I remembered the first time, and I did not know which possibility was worse. I sat at the canopy for a long time looking at it. I thought, this is what I have come to. I thought, 2.5 years ago I was a strike pilot in the 3rd Squadron with a husband who cut his hair when I came home, and a niece who held my hand at her grandmother's grave. And now, I am a woman in a one-way boat looking at the thing that is going to kill me, and the geometry of it is so clean that I cannot find a place in it where I would change a single line. On the 80th day I reached the coordinates. The structure was there. It was larger than I remembered. It was still breathing on the 40-second count. I sat my boat off its perimeter and I keyed the broadcast. I did not send a message. I sent myself. I let the wire light up. I let the leak open. I thought, as hard as I have ever thought anything, about the 30 seconds in the dark. I thought about the touch. I invited it back. It came. It came faster than I expected. The mind of the thing reached out and brushed against mine, and I felt the scale of it again, the count of its years, the count of its bodies, the patience, and I let it in. I let it see me. I let it see the human woman who had been so small and so alone and so disconnected, the broken finger of a small species that had drifted into its perimeter twice now, and I let the mind decide that the broken finger was no threat. I felt the mind decide. I felt the conclusion form. I felt it turn its attention elsewhere, the way you turn from a mosquito you have already swatted. And in the moment it turned, in the half-second of inattention, I burned hard. I burned the boat directly into the perimeter of the structure, past the outer weave, into the lit dark where the bodies hung in their stasis, and I keyed the payload, and the last thing I thought, the last thing I want anyone reading this to know I thought, was not vengeance. It was not spite. It was not even Aaron's face through the glass. It was Drew, standing in the doorway of the recovery ward with a bouquet of yellow flowers and his hair cut, looking at me with the kind of relief and love that I had been too broken to receive, and I thought, in the half-second before the payload found the ganglion, I am sorry. I am sorry. I am coming back to you the only way I have left. You will have figured out by now that I did not die. You are reading this. Someone is reading this. The payload went. The structure went. The shock traveled along the wire the way the planners had hoped it might, and somewhere out there a node of the Vaeli mind learned, for the first time in the count of its years, what it was to lose a finger that had decided, on its own, to be cut. And the boat, the stripped-down picket sled with no armor and no return fuel, was caught in the outer edge of the detonation and was thrown clear. tumbling, dead in space, on a slow drift back toward the inner system, and a recovery drone found it 11 months later, and inside the cockpit, in a survival cocoon I do not remember activating, was a woman who weighed 81 pounds and could not speak for the first 2 weeks after they pulled her out. I am writing this from the hospital. I am writing this slowly with one hand because the other one does not work yet and may not work again. Drew comes every day. He sits in the chair by the window and he reads to me from the news and he holds my hand when the nurses change the dressings. Iris comes on weekends. She is 21 now. She is studying engineering. She wants to work on the arrays the way her uncle did, the long ears that listen for the dark out past the line. She has not asked me about the bag in the back seat that day in the transit lot. I do not think she ever will. I think she has decided, the way she decided in the car coming back from the hub, that some things are between a woman and her own arithmetic. The war is not over. The Vaeli are still out there. I am told by people who come to the hospital with questions that the loss of the node has changed something in the way the hive moves, that it has become, in some small measurable way, more cautious. I do not know if this is true. I know that the color is gone. I have looked for it in every sunset for 11 months and I have not seen it. I think the wire burned out when the payload went. I think I gave it back to them, all of it, the 30 seconds and the 9 months and the bourbon and the bag in the back seat and Aaron's face through the glass, and the wire that was left in me is dark now, and I am, for the first time since the line, just a woman in a room with a window. I have been told I will receive a commendation. I have been told there will be a ceremony. I have told them through Drew that I will not attend. I have told them they can mail it. I have not earned a ceremony. I made the trade because the trade was available and because I was the one shaped to make it, and that is not heroism, that is geometry. The woman who deserves a ceremony is Captain Aaron Eccles, who looked at me through the glass of a coffee shop at 5 in the morning and decided to let me live, and who paid for that decision 8 months later in a place I would not wish on anyone, and whose name I would like, if anyone is still reading this, to be the name that is spoken when the node is spoken of. Not mine. Hers. Drew is here. He has just come in. He has brought me coffee, the way he brings me coffee every morning, and he is putting a hand on the small of my back lightly, the way he does, and he is asking nothing of me except that I come home. I am going to put the pen down now. I am going to drink the coffee while it is hot. The window faces east. The sun is coming up over the fence. I am a small woman in a small room on a small planet, and the smallness today is enough.